Fate's Forge, a D&D podcast. Hello, adventurers. Andy with Fate's Forge podcast here with the very first podcast in my podcast series on this channel. Welcome. It is my pleasure to meet you guys and be here with you. As you guys have probably heard, I've come from YouTube basically to jump into the podcast world because I kind of want to throw my hat in the ring. I've got some notes prepared, and as the title suggests, we're going to be going over some of the barriers to entry for Dungeons and Dragons. So I kind of want to title this podcast, So You Want to Start D&D. A lot of people that I've talked to, whether they're relatives, whether they're friends, whether they're neighbors, when it comes to some of my interests, have been, what is D&D? Why isn't that something that was on Stranger Things? Isn't that something that was in the 80s? Are you a nerd? All of these questions can be answered, and hopefully I will answer them here in this podcast. I'm sure that this style of podcast has definitely been done already. I'm also trying to build this content here, which will lead up to the bigger podcast that we'll be releasing in October. So before I get into it, I just wanted to let you know, October 1st, mark your calendars, make sure you follow, make sure you subscribe, make sure you have this page bookmarked, because I am going to be releasing our first podcast, and hopefully not the only podcast on this series, in podcast form. There's also going to be the video variant on all the other platforms that you'll be able to catch, but this is going to be cut up into episodic, listenable radio style adventure, D&D adventure, while you're at work, while you're at home, while you're at play. So please mark that. It's going to be called Van Richton's Guide to the Curse of Strahd. Van Richton's Guide to Ravenloft is a resource book that came out just recently about gothic horror podcasts. Campaigns, sorry. I can't edit out. I have to do this all in one take. I'm trying. It's hard coming from a YouTuber who has very edited, very clean content to a podcast where I'm just sitting and talking to a camera. So I appreciate you guys bearing with me in this new medium for me. With that said, the podcast I'm going to be coming out with heavily uses the resources from Van Richton's Guide to Ravenloft, which is basically a D&D resource for GMs, DMs, for creating a gothic horror campaign. Now, Curse of Strahd has been around since the beginning. It's the most common, if you think of D&D, most likely you've heard of Curse of Strahd. This campaign, at least, this terrible archdevil, not really a devil, but he's a vampire, this demigod, this dreadlord, dark lord, whatever you call it. They've changed the word so much. And the goal of Curse of Strahd is to relieve the folks of Barovia from the horrible grasp of, Strahd. He's a terrible, very old vampire. And so what I'm doing is I'm going to take that classic adventure and I'm going to be including a lot of the new materials, including dark gifts, new backgrounds, lineages, as well as a lot of the domain content. And so look out for that. I'm really excited to share that. I've got 5 really awesome friends, colleagues, and performers who are going to be, your players throughout this whole journey. So make sure you mark your calendars. October 1st, the first episode is going to run. And then hopefully we're going to be able to do it weekly, 12 episodes leading up to, maybe the first big act, maybe the second act. In this series. So that was a lot about really nothing. I'm sorry. Again, longer form here. Let's get back into, what we're really talking about today, which is how to get into D&D. How do you get into it? It seems daunting. You've probably Googled, what's D&D, how to get into D&D, and you're getting all of this content here from a lot of these influencers who are gamers, or you've got voice actors, or you've got actors and actresses who have these high budget, very, very well produced campaigns. One obviously that comes to mind is Critical Role. That's really what got me into it. Titan's Forge was another thing that got me into it by Will Wheaton. That's a fantastic D&D podcast that you can definitely listen to, but the video is really awesome on VRV. Not a sponsor. Nonetheless, I consumed D&D culture from about 2013 to 2015. That's when Twitch was really big. I was a Twitch streamer, and I wanted to follow, more pop culture. And so Dungeons and Dragons, really, really, I guess, filled that void in my life. I had just got out of college. I had just had my wife had our third son. We moved into a big city, and I needed something to listen to while I drove an hour to work and back each day. So with that said, I want to try to answer a lot of questions that are commonly asked when it comes to Dungeons and Dragons. And so I've got a list here of 5 things that I want to touch on to approach answering this question. So the first thing is just jump into it. Even though it's daunting, even though there's a source book, a player's handbook that's literally like 250 pages long, it's not really 250 pages of sheer rules. There's a lot of lore and world building and deities and planes of existence and a lot of stuff that you really don't need to worry about as a player, as someone who is going to be playing in a campaign. That's mainly meant for the dungeon master who's going to be creating the story, creating the narrative. And so don't worry about trying to understand the different levels or the different realms. And I don't even know it myself, and I've been in it, almost 8 years now. With that said, what I'd highly recommend that you do is join the community. Go into the community and just jump in with 2 feet. I'm going to talk more about the community itself, where to go to, what resources you have. But the first note to jump into it is to get into a community, because it really is. Dungeons and Dragons has been around since the 80s. There are veterans, there are brand new folks. But what's awesome about it is the community is so inclusive. They're so nice. When I jumped into it originally, I thought there was going to be, the typical, cold shoulders, or like the typical, I'm a veteran, I'm the best, just sit and look pretty and don't ask questions. No, most, if not every single instance that I've had where I've played in a game store or with a bunch of randos, it's been fantastic. They've all been super welcoming, super inclusive, and super helpful. So, I will admit you're going to need to learn, have an open mind to learning this game, because it does get pretty nuanced. It does get pretty detailed. However, you can just jump into it. You can do it. So the first thing that I recommend that you do is jump into it, right? There are a couple of, these Dungeons and Dragons, starter guides that you can do if you wanted to play more like a board game with roommates or with your family. Excuse me. And, you can get those, but those are a very, very prefabbed, very linear type of game. The starting that the D&D folks have, these intro packages or these intro boxes, they're almost all the same through each iteration. They really recycle the content. And so I'm not really too keen about that. But nonetheless, you can still jump into these starter packs. You can get them at Target. You can get them at pretty much in any game store. But most of the game stores will say, hey, don't. Just come to our weekly Adventures Guild. So most game stores have an Adventures Guild. I want to recommend going. At least in my area, there's about 4 that are within about a 2-mile radius. And I'm not in a huge metropolitan city anymore. I moved down south of Salt Lake City. Salt Lake City itself has like 5 to 10 places that I can think of. Where I'm at, there's at least 4. And each one of them has their own adventure league, or at least they did before the pandemic. The one store that I do typically go to regularly has, they just restarted it in August, which is really exciting. Now, I'm already running 3 different campaigns, and so I haven't had a chance really to jump in, but it's usually Wednesday nights. You can go for 2 to 3 hours, and they'll teach you how to create a character. They'll teach you the world of Dungeons and Dragons, and they'll even have folks there that will, DM. If you want to go and DM and run your own campaign, Adventure League is the best way to do it. That's where I started my adventurers. That's where I started my campaign. So those are a few things that I recommend. There's also a whole community on these different websites like Roll20. That's the one that I mainly use. But they have a whole community forum where you can literally just jump into a game based on campaign, based on style, whatever you want. It's really, really awesome. Again, they are really, really nice. And I really like Roll20 because it's more of an interactive, digital video game rather than, playing like a tabletop board game. And so Roll20 does have a learning curve of using it. But again, all the folks there that are in the community are so helpful and ready to provide guidance. I recommend using those if you don't have in your area an open or, an opened up game store. Okay, so that's basically my first section. Let's talk about the next section. The rules, right? So when it comes to Dungeons and Dragons, there's a lot of rules. There is a full player's handbook that you have to, kind of base all of your decisions on. And sometimes it gets kind of daunting what choices you really have and can make in the game. Because the game itself is based on 2 different styles of games, 2 different genres of playing. There's role-playing, non-combat game, more like narrative-driven play style. And then there's tactical tabletop board game fights. So anytime that you're out of combat and you're interacting with characters in the story that are not players or NPCs, you're going to be role playing. You're going to be play acting. So there is some performative theater. You don't have to bring a voice, a whole character if you want. The way that you build your character, and we'll touch on that. We'll give you some points of reference to base, your personality on. There's ideals, there's bonds, there's flaws, there's backgrounds, and you build that all yourself. And that's what the beauty is of Dungeons and Dragons. There's such a creative element to it that I love so much. So when it comes to the rules here, honestly, that's the biggest barrier to entry. What's great though, and I'll have it here on the screen, you'll see if you're looking at the video, they've got an awesome revamped app. The folks at Dungeons and Dragons, they've invested heavily in the D&D Beyond website as well as the app. And without paying a cent, you literally get, all the base resources for free. Now, you don't get the source books. You're going to need to pay for those, but they always have a good deal. You can get the basic, Dungeon Master's Guide, the Player's Handbook, and the Monster Manual, usually for under $100. Which I think is a steal of a deal. I think for a while they had like 30% off it, which probably brings it down to like $80 for all of them. But if you're going out and buying a board game, typical board game that's not like your Candyland or your Chutes and Ladders is around $50 to $100. So, and then if you're just buying one book, your local game store will sell it for about $25. So it's not too huge of a barrier to entry. I think the biggest is your time. So with that said, as I've shown you on the side here, D&D Beyond provides you the base rules of the game. And not only just, creating a character, but it's got a lot of the races, classes, it's got a lot of the equipment, how to play the game, what your ability scores are, what are feats, what are skills, what are backgrounds. And so it breaks it down. It almost gives you the whole player's handbook because, I think it's smart. I think they should definitely provide the core base game for free if they want to add more people in the community. And I think, Wizards have done that. Wizards is the company. So with that said, the rules are free. You really don't need to pay much to get into the game. Heck, I played with someone for over a year who rented from the library the player's handbook. So you could go to your local library and try to pick it up. The second thing that I think is crucial is getting to know how to fight. Again, it's tactical fighting where everyone has one turn each round, and you go each round until the objective is completed or the enemy is defeated. Okay? So as a player character, you're going to be allotted certain actions each turn. Typical, modern tabletop games have this same structure where each person around the table is going to take their turn. They're allotted certain actions, certain resources that they can expend in order to complete certain actions, feats, skills, or attacks. And so with that in mind, it really does follow your typical board game. If you've ever played anything, again, a little more complicated than your Monopolies, even your Risks. I mean, Risks, you have, your typical going around the table, taking turns, dominating or conquering. So with that said, I would get to know, create your character first, then get to know fighting. But then again, my third point when it comes to the rules is just jump into it with both feet forward and don't look back. You don't need to be an expert to join a table. And I think being honest with everyone around the table and being like, look, this is my first time. I've watched, listened, read this. Help me here. But I really want to learn. I want to play because I want to have fun, because a lot of people have fun playing this. So with that said, join a table, join a group. And, you might think that the crowd or the community that, draws the people to this community are a little more reclusive, a little more this, a little more that. And that's not true. Really, I've played with all walks of life in the last 8 years. I've played with students. I've played with kids. I've played with parents. I've played with grandparents. I've played with, rich people. I've played with, high school students. So there's really no person that I think that this game doesn't fit for. So with that said, you really don't need to, do what all of the most popular podcasts or gaming channels have been doing. You just do what feels comfortable for you and pick it. Let's go ahead now and talk about building a character. Building a character may seem daunting because, honestly, there's a lot to it. You have to pick a race. Each race has its own specific skills and ability ability score increases. They may have languages. They may have certain traits, certain feats. They may have even certain spells that they're able to cast as a certain race. When you have a character race, you then are able to choose a class. It's like a job, right? But not like a farmer or a blacksmith. It's more like a combat role. You're a fighter, you're a monk, you're a wizard, you're a sorcerer, you're a warlock. When it comes to choosing and playing a character, I highly recommend playing your melee, in the fray, soldier type character, right? You can definitely consider trying something more advanced like a spellcaster or an arcane caster. And that'll be a little more difficult. That's going to require a little bit more effort in trying to understand the rules to spell casting, spell slots, and all that good stuff. How to cast, how to build a character using the correct ability score to, cast spells. You don't want to be a fighter and then you don't want to have strength when you're, a wizard casting spell. So there's a little more strategy to it, which I don't think it's impossible for you to have an awesome character for your first character, but just know it's a learning curve and everyone's around to help you. A lot of people will follow these YouTube channels that do what's called min-maxing, or providing you the maximum damage or the maximum amount of skills and abilities for the minimum amount of effort, right? So instead of picking your typical human, you'll pick like a dark elf drow who has certain innate abilities that a typical human wouldn't. And then you can pair that, interestingly, with another type of class, like a warlock hexblade, and you can add certain things to each other so you can get bonuses. But you don't have to you don't have to do that if you don't want to. You can just be your typical, human fighter, and you can still do a lot of damage. The top 3 classes that I'd recommend for first starters is a fighter, a barbarian, and then a rogue. I think those are your, most common hand-to-hand melee, not necessarily like punching, but melee fighters, which I think are the easiest barrier to entry into, the world of D&D, right? My second recommendation when it comes to building a character is use pop culture, right? Use fiction movies that you've watched that you can mimic or role play, right? You could be Batman. You could be your favorite anime character. You could be Goku from Dragon Ball Z. You could be Strider or Aragorn from The Lord of the Rings. You could be whoever you want to, honestly. And I think there's enough variation within the world of Dungeons and Dragons that you can really make your own character. My cousin, who will be playing with us in my podcast in October, he decided to make a character based off his favorite character on 30 Rock. He named him Jack Dragony. He really likes Jack character. And then his little familiar was a Tina Fey's character. I don't watch 30 Rock, but you can do that. For me, my first character that I copied was the Goblin Slayer from the anime Goblin Slayer. So I picked and tried to base off of that whole character arc a character in D&D, and it was one of my favorite characters. He was a paladin warlock, and he could do some serious damage. I really min-maxed that guy. Nonetheless, you really can do whatever you want. Actually, to be honest, my first character I based off was Gangplank from League of Legends. This was 5-6 years ago when I was playing League of Legends. I based a character off Gangplank, and I kicked butt. It was loosely. There was no guns. The DM that I played with didn't allow guns. But nonetheless, I was able to use more like a swashbuckler before the swashbuckler was released recently. With that said, here, when you're building a character, those are a few of the things that I recommend that you focus on. If you want to make a little halfling like Frodo Baggins, you definitely can. You can make a burglar, a halfling burglar, and they're really good. They're really, really easy rogue characters. If you wanted to make, like a loony, like sorceress that, has very high level spells, but has like low fatigue, like from Konosuba, the, what was her name? The Crimson Sorceress or the Explosion Sorceress. I can't remember her name. Anyway, you can do that. The sky's the limit. I made another character, Teemo from League of Legends, who was a ranger that shot from a blowgun and did incredible damage. It was pretty awesome. So really, the sky's the limit when you're building a character. And all of the resources, again, are in the D&D app that you can check out. Alrighty, so now that we've gone over, testing the waters, jumping in with 2 feet, just jumping into it, to the rules and the world of D&D, to building a character, I want to talk about now some of the places that you can go to join a community. Because again, you can spend all the time reading and getting the books, but then, where do I go to join the community? Where do I go to start, right? I don't have very many friends. I might be this, might be that, might be a little more introverted. Where do I start, right? I'd recommend online community, right? If you wanted to and you love Critical Role, there are there's subreddits, there's Twitter communities, Facebook groups that you can join, and even local Facebook and Twitter and Reddit communities that you can join that, definitely you can figure out and even play online. So I alluded to this website called Roll20. This is not a sponsored ad. This is just something that I recommend because it's a really good tool. So when you log in, create an account, which is free, you can also, get any of the resources from Dungeons and Dragons that integrates into this website. It's pretty cool. So you could buy some of the books, character classes and races that integrate into this. It's very much almost a video game-esque like thing with like a Zoom feel to it, right? So you've got your camera and your microphone, which shows up on the main screen, and the screen shows the map, right? The dungeon master is going to provide a map, to share the world with you. And so it can be a lot more, maybe a lot more creative than in person. When you're playing in person, some people just use pencil and paper. When you're using Roll20, you have interactive maps, right? You have little player tokens, so you can import your own character profile sheet, and you can control your character within the world of Dungeons and Dragons, or at least in Roll20. And with that said, I think it's pretty intuitive. During Dungeons and Dragons, during the pandemic, I had 2 campaigns that was running totally on Roll20, and it was terrific. We had a blast. It was so much fun. We played Dungeons of the Mad Mage, and then the first half of my current campaign with Icewind Dale, the Rime of the Frost Maiden, was played on Roll20. And then we shifted to in-person once, my area opened up from the pandemic. So with that said, Roll20 I think is really good. It's got integrated stuff. It's got really cool DM tools if you want to be a DM. That's where I'd recommend, first, if you're a little more introverted and don't want to, go out of your comfort zone and go to an actual local place. Next up is obviously going to your local gaming store. Like I was saying earlier, there's lots of gaming stores. Anywhere that they sell Magic the Gathering or board games, they're most likely going to do Dungeons and Dragons because, we'll be honest, most of the owners who loved and were raised in Dungeons and Dragons are the store owners. I mean, I'll be honest. Our local store owner, shout out to Gamers Inn. They're big Dungeons and Dragons players, and they always play every Wednesday or every Tuesday. So anyway, join your local Adventures League. Like I'd mentioned earlier, Adventures League is, the best breeding grounds for learning the game, interacting with people, understanding the rules, and really having a great time in performance theater, improv theater here. And so joining your local gaming is super important. Then you're also supporting local businesses and whatnot, because they're most likely gonna house all of the figurines. I mean, we haven't even talked about the whole arts and painting aspect of this, which is a whole nother world and a whole nother podcast that I'm planning on doing. So with that said, your community there, you can even start your own. You don't have to do the you don't have to do the Adventures League there. My cousin and I posted our campaign, and we got 3 or 4 really solid people that we're still playing with now from just posting on their local forum board, like not the actual digital one, but the actual board on there. It said, we're looking for players, call this. And we got some really solid folks that I've been playing with for the last 6 months. So and we decided to pick a different day that was a lot quieter, and we could play in our own little corner in the local game store, and it was fantastic. I loved it. They even provided some materials like maps for combat and whatnot. So with that said, the local gaming store is a very awesome option to join the community locally. I personally, it's difficult for me because I'll be honest, when I played video games online, I always got bullied because I was some of the worst when I played with randos. And so I don't like just jumping into a random, Discord server or like jumping into a random community. But locally, where I show my face and I interact with other people, that's where I found the most joy and the most success. And then there's obviously the different social medias. You can go on Reddit, you can go on Twitter, you can go on YouTube. Those are some of the places, the communities where you can jump in and just enjoy everything Dungeons and Dragons, all the culture. So the last thing that I wanted to note here that I wanted to talk about is, the physical and mental benefit of joining Dungeons and Dragons. Now, I don't have any studies, but I could have done some research and studied this. But in general, obviously, your mental health is greatly impacted by your social interactions with people, right? Whether it's at school, growing up, your family, your friends, your community around you. As humans, we are very social creatures, and historically, we've been in tribes. We've lived together in a community of local tribes, sharing similar values, similar ideologies, similar resources and geographic locations, and with the emergence of and growth of, I guess, our society. How we become more global with the expansion of the internet. I'm getting to a point here, guys. With, the emergence of the internet and digital spaces, social networking, I really think these local societies and cultures and communities have really suffered, to be honest. And I think in general, us as individuals have suffered because we haven't had that local interaction. You can still have an online interaction locally with like friends, roommates, club members, and playing D&D. And so this is why I love D&D so much, because it really helps knit back together those societies, those cultures locally that have been impacted because of, the emergence of the industrial age and the internet and the way that we interact with each other, especially now with the pandemic. I think Dungeons and Dragons is super important. I don't know if there's maybe sports. I think you could say college football has been one of those real big cultural things, but sports isn't for everyone. And I feel like sports, those folks that aren't into sports may be more inclined to Dungeons and Dragons. That I may be wrong. So wrapping this all up here, Dungeons and Dragons really benefits your mental health because of the social interaction that's required to play the game, right? It's not like Monopoly where you're just kind of going around each turn and having fun and trying to steal from each other. It's not just a one-time thing. It's really a longer term commitment that you're an active player in this tiny world that's being built. And you can't just go once. There is some form of commitment. And I really think that that's important in your adult social life, is that you have some commitment to those around you who share same preferences, who share the same interests, ideologies, philosophies. It's important that there is some form of commitment that brings you back to it. And I really like Dungeons and Dragons for that reason, because that's so important for our mental health and for reducing the decline in our in our mental health. Physically, you're not working out, you're really sitting down, but there's some times where I feel like I'm sweating bullets because I'm having to improv, or I'm having to react in a certain situation on on without an immediate reaction. But what I mean physical is like your mental health definitely impacts your physical health. And if you're not interacting with humans physically or, online, given your constraint, I think that it does impact your physical health. So, again, I'm not a scientist. I'm not trying to espouse some ideology on you, but I just in my observance here, I feel like the overall satisfaction of the folks that I play with increases as we've played together, and especially since I've been a DM, creating the environments where everyone succeeds towards a common goal. I think even though it's make believe, it's still really awesome. I mean, a number of my friends and colleagues came together about a year ago, and we've been playing this campaign for a year. And some of my favorite experiences have been in the last year or so, where once we've gotten together and I've put together this this challenge or these obstacles for them to complete. Once they completed it and they did it with style, with creativity, with precision and strategy, it was like the best euphoric feeling that I was even able to feel and participate in, even though they were defeating me and I was the loser. It was still so much fun. I love it. There's nothing better than that. So I wanted to talk about some of the bonuses of pursuing and playing and committing to Dungeons and Dragons. So it relieves stress, right? Stress is a huge thing that I think a lot of us can agree has increased since the pandemic. Even since, launching into adulthood. I mean, I'll be honest, stress has been such a hard thing for me to manage, and it's resulted, I think, in a self-diagnosis of not acute, but just general anxiety. In 2014, 2015, on one of my vlogs that I did, I came out and said, I think I've self-diagnosed myself with anxiety. And in the last 5 years, I really haven't set goals to proactively reduce that. But I think I can confidently say I don't have anxiety anymore. And I think it's strictly because of Dungeons and Dragons. And that's kind of crazy to say. I know it's an anecdote. I know it's my own experience. But as I've, had a community to rely on, to lean on and to be a part of regularly, it has really helped me overcome and accomplish a lot of goals that I needed to accomplish as a man, as a husband, as a father, as a career man. And so that's why, I'm sitting here for the last 10 minutes trying to build this whole, hypothesis or this whole, argument here that it really does help your health. So stress is one thing. It's an absolutely creative environment. I mean, whether you like performance theater or not, it really is. You have to be able to improv. Well, you learn to improv, and it's not just the dungeon master who's leading you and reading a story. It's really, the story really unfolds as each character, as each person in the group kind of finds where they fit in the role and what they add to. And as they participate actively in non-combat situations, I've really found some of the most rewarding, the funnest, some of the funnest sessions have literally been non-combative at all. In other words, there's no fighting in the game. You're not fighting, demons or creatures or blobs or whatever. It's been some of the social interactions or the improv that has led to overcoming obstacles within the narrative that have been some of the most rewarding. So, I've alluded to it already, but one of the third things that this helps with your mental health and as a benefit is problem solving, right? You're put up against these really, really technical beasts and characters that have actions, and they're trying to kill your character, and you have to defend as a group and keep everyone alive within that group. And sometimes, like this last week, I sent 4 very difficult waves of creatures in separate instances to my characters, my players, and all of them, each one of them took a different type of approach in order to accomplish the goal. So problem solving is a huge part of it. Not to mention the 2 different role-playing interactions that they had were so much fun. With that, communication's huge. A lot of people, who are drawn to Dungeons and Dragons may be, more introverted. It really helps take you out of your shell. For me as a dungeon master, I always like to make sure that everyone on the table in a non-combat instance has a say. Sometimes there'll be one that is, very, very extroverted and very, very, in your face, and that could be their character's ideal or their flaw. But I always like to interrupt them, like, hold on, let's hear the rest of the group. What does, you're a character, Billy, what do you want to do? And, I like to put people on the spot. And some of the most interesting, or at least most impressive, like improv performance theater that I've had with some of the player characters have been some of those who have been a little more apprehensive, and it's been fantastic. They've gotten their confidence up. It's helped them be more communicative in describing what they want to do, and ultimately that leads to positive, human interactions outside of the game as well. You learn how to communicate with those around you better. Next is, lastly, is friendship and love. Believe it or not, there was a group I played with about 2 years ago where 2 of the folks met each other and now they're married happily. So it builds lifelong friendships. And because it's so important, because, you as a group of 4 to 6, you need to accomplish some impossible tasks. And when you do that together, whether you succeed or fail, you're going to remember those, and that's going to knit your relationship together and your bond. And some friends that are now, I would say some of my best friends, lifelong friends, have been because of D&D. And I think it's fantastic. So don't rule out that aspect and benefit to playing and joining D&D. So with that said, I think I hope I didn't lose the plot. This was more of a way to convince you of why you should join Dungeons and Dragons. If you have had an interest in it and wanted to start, but you've been a little, skittish to do so, hopefully some of these points that I've gone over have been helpful enough for you to jump into the community. With that said, guys, I'm going to go ahead and leave it here. We're approaching about 45 minutes, and I want to make sure that I keep these podcasts between 40 and 45 minutes. Thanks so much for being here, guys. Make sure you rate, like, subscribe, follow, all that good stuff. We're on, all the podcasts that are out there. We're also on Instagram. We're on Facebook. We are on YouTube. We are on TikTok even. Go check those out. It's been a pleasure to meet you guys. My name is Andy. This is Fate's Forge. We'll see you on the next one. Fate's Forge, a D&D podcast.